All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the GUAC Community Maintenance Meeting. This meeting is being recorded, will be posted online. Participation in the meeting is in accordance with LF antitrust policies as well as the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. And awesome. Good to see everyone here. As usual, we're going to start with welcoming any new friends. Is there anyone that would like to introduce themselves? All right. If not, we have a very light agenda today, mainly discussing the response for the RFC for the CISA as well new minimum elements requirements document. Other than that, any other things that folks want to cover that we should add to the agenda?
I can just give you a brief status of migration of Trustify and things like that. But
okay, maybe let's start with that since it's brief.
okay, so I think we are in a good place. All important repos are there, so people are working normally. We fixed all the hiccups that we had and enabled most of the bots and things like that. So I think from that perspective, we're in a good place. Next would be to go through. So currently I created just one team with all the committers that we had. Most of the committers that we had, I excluded some people that are gone from the project for a few years. So most all active committers in the project, but I would like to start proper governments like the GUAC project have. So to change things and provide appropriate ladder and things like that. And then go. The next thing is to tackle the dependency analytics and all accompanied projects. I was looking a little bit at it. I think we can move most of the repos that are not that are not exact plugin and things like that, which we need to fix the branding and things. But all the utility repos, I think they can go pretty quickly. So something to do this week.
Awesome.
Peter, also a question for you. So we talked a little bit about more using the GUAC Slack, right? And I was thinking maybe we have this internal Red Hat forum for TPA. So maybe try to encourage people instead of using that to jump in and for general questions use the GUAC one.
Yeah,
just something to think. No answer now. Just think about it.
You definitely probably have to generate like a new one that will be public facing. But I wanted to ask because I joined the OpenSSF Slack, and I saw that usually the projects have their own channel. Is it something that is worth exploring? Like, should we have there a channel for everyone to talk to in that Slack, or
so I think
the projects are not using it too much?
I think the idea that we discussed last week was that we start using the existing GUAC channel more. And then if things get too noisy, then we explore more channels and things like that.
Got it. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't here last week.
Yeah.
Got it.
So maybe something to think about how to,
I'll definitely check.
Yeah. And we also talked that we can maybe. I know you had that also the bot like we have for metric channel about activity on the GitHub. That can be something that can go upstream as well instead of the separate channel. So So just maybe to rethink how we can, move more communication upstream. That's I think the goal.
Okay, got it.
I think that's all on this topic. So far so good. I think so. We'll move this next bunch of repos, and I think that's it. And then we will go to justification, archive most of the things that are not currently used, and basically leave just a couple of repos that are still up related to the TPA projects, and then over time figure out how to separate upstream and downstream activities and move the upstream stuff also to GUAC. But that would take a little bit more time, but yeah, I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I was also kind of thinking, I think once the repos are in, it may be helpful to maybe do a webinar or something with OpenSSF, so that people can try it out and they know how to build it and how to run it. I think that would be cool.
Yeah, definitely. Let's plan for it for the next couple of months or weeks.
Yeah, I think, was it Ben or Michael? Did you do the schedule the last one? What's the process of that like?
The last one we did for GUAC that I was on was kind of dropped on my lap, so I'm not sure, but we can connect with OpenSSF marketing once we have kind of like an idea of what, like in abstract or something, we can navigate that process.
Yeah, there's not really anything super formal. It's pretty much what Ben said. Get something like, just get like a quick like summary of what you want to do, go to the OpenSSF, and then they'll kind of do it. There's been a couple of like false stops and starts on a ongoing webinar sort of program. I think the challenge they've had is just not enough folks have wanted to give regular webinars for it to overwhelm the marketing team. So they're at this point, I think they're mostly like, yeah, just come ask us and we'll set something up. And then if it ever gets like too if it ever gets too busy or too complicated, that's when they would start to institute some process.
Yeah, let's try to do it. Maybe before I would like to enhance a little bit our documentation, so that we can point to people to good docs that they can kickstart things and easily play with it. But yeah, that's all doable. Let's add it to the list.
Sounds good. All right. If not, I think that's thanks for the update, Dan. Let's talk about S4 minimum elements. So yeah, I think just to stage this, right? And for those that weren't here last week, we were discussing this RFC that's been put up by CISA, basically from the NIST minimum elements document from, I don't know when that was, like way too long ago, almost a decade ago at this point, I think. They're creating a update to that. I think this recognizes a lot of the challenges in creating SBOMs and tries to kind of clarify and provide additional context, like, what is the context in which the SBOM was generated, the tooling and all that. Yeah, so it is a clarification. I think for the most part, it's all stuff that makes sense. I think there are also like a lot of challenges which are not quite yet addressed. But yeah, I there was if you're curious and haven't looked at it yet, let me put the link to the document and Zoom. And then if you want to just get a quick, oh, thank you, you've done that. And then let me share my screen really quick. Most of the changes really are highlighted in the summary of them as in the appendix. Share screen. Okay. Yeah. So I guess let's open up the floor. I think general comments and what we think if we were to like, oh yes, we should create a response to this, and why we should do that and what we should say.
So only topic that was new to me was the known unknowns, and so I haven't seen any examples of these kind of things even before. I wonder if anybody else did something about this. So just in short, I think what this says is that we should consider every SBOM as uncompleted by default, and that producer of the SBOM should state that if SBOM should be considered complete, or that there are things that are not included because of some kind of privacy thing, or some other way. So I didn't see any examples of that in the wild. So anybody else?
I haven't seen any myself as well. But I suppose this happens quite a bit in the more sensitive spaces. Yeah, I haven't seen it as well because really it is about sharing third-party information.
Yeah, just wondering how this would look in for example, SPDX or Cyclone DX, and how we're gonna present this information to people. Yeah.
I think that's TBD.
Cool.
I guess do you have a hunch that it's going to be difficult to do this?
No. Just
Okay.
wondering. Yeah. Just wondering about technicalities, basically. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense definitely as a feature.
I think on this point, one of the things that I think the document did talk about the distribution problem, and it was like what was it? Okay, I guess this was separate. This was on the distribution and delivery. Yeah, I think my thought on the distribution and delivery one was one of the recommendations that at least we were thinking about was saying that, in SPDX 2.0, there was basically a mandate that your document should be CC 1.0. And so it's like it's shareable, and so if you get something from a vendor, you can share it. You can have additional contractual terms to say that you can't redistribute the SBOM. But in the spirit of it, that's just what it's supposed to be for. I think this is no longer the case in SPDX trio. So then it becomes a question of like, it sounds like they're suggesting that everyone just create a API and then you do the version the access control separately by itself. Mike, do you want to share some of your thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit a lot of them. You know, I think the ones that I think are kind of like, of course, is around the new stuff, the new ones. Which one was component hash, if available, like should be part of it, which I think is definitely one of the biggest ones. Because of course, like, hey, if I get the hash, then I can always go back and say like, oh, these two packages that came from two different places are actually technically the same package, versus these two packages that came from, you know, different places are in some way different, even if they are technically, like, for all intents and purposes the same. We can't actually determine that because they have two separate hashes. And so it helps with stuff like, you know, understanding exactly, you know, because this particular thing I think was something that came up several times recently of like, oh, actually, this is only vulnerable if you got this version that was built in this way by this, you know, that whatever. So there was that. There was also the one second here. Let me just bring this up here. There was also, to a lesser extent, the license stuff. Including license is always a good thing. Tool name, I think, was one of the other ones that I think is super important, like the ability to know where the SBOM came from. What tool developed, you know, generated it, because I know that was a thing that came up a couple of times of like, hey, certain tools are better than others. And so understanding what tool and what version of the tool was used to make it, that's important. And then the other one being purpose of the SBOM. Like, sorry, not purpose.
Context, right?
Yeah,
Generation
context.
context,
Yeah. The generation context one, I think were to me the most important, because knowing that a SBOM was a pre-build, a build, or a post-build SBOM is helps you understand, like, did you infer it? Like, did you read through? Did you infer it? Did you infer it either from like a requirements file or from the actual sort of image or whatever, the binary that came out, and you did some analysis against it? Or did you actually track what's happening in the build? Because they'll all have different varying levels of accuracy there.
Yeah, I think I agreed with everything there. I'm kind of curious, like when I was thinking about the hash information, I was almost like, I like it, but I kind of feel like we should go one step further to say like, okay, like if everyone generates different types of hashes, then we're screwed either way. Like we need everyone to generate the same type of hash, right? So I think I'm inclined to say let's go one step further and say that, like, at least maybe like what SPDX does, right? You need to have at least SHA-1. I was saying everything should have a SHA-1 or SHA-256 as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, so I agree with, if we are going hash, we might as well go and say, hey, let's all use SHA-256 or whatever. I do think that there's still it's like, my thoughts on it are, it's a little bit of like, there's a lot of inertia to get folks to do that. But once they do that, then you get all the benefits that I think folks can get from GUAC and Trustify, et cetera, because then you're able to go and say, actually, these two packages are in some way different. Yeah.
One of the other things that I think. Sorry, did someone want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted. So I wonder if the component hash is maybe not meant for like alternative to the component version, right? So it mentions that the component version is changing. That when it's not specified, the creation date may be used for comparison. And because the component like, so we see that a lot with container images, right? That they don't have actually versions, they have hashes instead, right?
Yeah.
So, and this may be actually for that purpose, right? Because you don't have a version specified, then you have just hash, but for comparison purposes, the creation date of SBOM would be like, considered. Right? Like, so you get like at build time, you you build a container image, you record the hash and content, obviously, and you can compare it with like the yesterday's build after that. Maybe that could be the meaning of the component hash then.
I guess I'm curious for that, right? Because I think like if we generate a poll today for container image, it's largely like you said, it's a hash. Like the OCI poll is a hash. But if we have a container CVE, then I guess like how will we end up doing the matching, right? In the end, at the end of the day, like
Yeah, I'm not sure, right? Because like in my opinion, the just considering the date, right? Like wouldn't be enough, right? Because you can potentially rebuild it, right? And with the same exact, like reproducible build, ideally you get the same output. But just because you can generate it tomorrow doesn't mean it's newer version, actually, right? But yeah.
is that a specific recommendation you would have here that you think could be helpful?
Yeah, so maybe like if so to clarify the purpose of the hash more, right? Should it be like really like checksum of all the content, or is it like identifier, meant? Because if it's meant to be like for the OCI images, I don't know, to identify them. In their case, it's also usually by hash, right? But by content, but maybe it's meant to mean something different. That's not clear exactly here, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point about container images. I feel like that container images has been a problem. um, I think there is one of the comments I think I had around dependency relationship. Like I like that they're saying like, sorry, not this one. There was a one about whether it's a transitive dependency, like adding structure into. Which one was it?
Maybe depth.
Depth. Which one was it? Yeah. Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I wanted to point out here is like mentioning whether you have the component, whether it's a transitive or like basically creating the structure. But I think that is also a lot of the time where you don't know. And you need to be able to specify like I depend on this and I don't know what the depth is. Because I imagine if they force it so that like it's like you can either do direct or indirect, then people will put in false like incorrect information if they don't know how to fill it. I kind of curious about the distribution and delivery stuff, because I think this is where it would affect the stuff that we are doing quite a bit, right? Because we want to be able to pull SBOMs directly. We want to be able to use them. Do we have any stronger thoughts on this particular aspect of it?
I was looking at the statement up the page 10. I don't know, it reads good to me.
Okay.
Should we have something about, I don't know, version control? Does that make sense? So,
For the SBOM?
yeah, keep, if you deliver them through the GitHub or Git repository or something like that. Just thinking out loud, yeah.
I think that's so they had this which I was actually against, which there was a last updated timestamp, not timestamp. Where was it?
It is the timestamp, but
It's on the timestamp. Maybe I missed it. Yeah, I think this one was where I was a bit, I didn't like it because it made it sound to me as forms are should be immutable. Sorry, immutable, and you just generate a new one. But I think it's like container versions, right? Where it's like, yeah, I don't know what the, because then you're versioning your SBOMs like your software.
but how would you distinct two SBOMs that are built for the same software, just with some changes because of the process or tooling or something like that?
So I feel like this is something on a life cycle. So we were chatting with a bunch of folks about VEX, right? And like in CSEF, they have um, they have this automation that says like what changed within a repository, right? So you're like listening on the API or listening on a bucket or something, and then you download the CSV file that's called changes.csv, and then you see like, oh, did anything change? So I have to get an updated version of this facts, the back statement. And I imagine if there's an update to the SBOM, they may need something like that. At the same time, I'm not sure whether it's necessary because I'm not sure whether the frequency of updating the SBOM versus the frequency of updating the piece of software.
So I like how like in Toto and attestations do this, where they separate the timestamp from the content that you are timestamping. So, because at the end of the day, what folks will want to know is the content the same? And then if let's say the content is the same, okay, what's maybe what's the timeline? When did these things get generated? And that's hard to do, right? Like if I have I don't know, 10 megabyte SBOM or even larger, right? Like if I have 100 megabyte SBOM and it doesn't include a timestamp, I only have to check, like if I just, I could just check two 100 megabyte checksums and that's it, right? But if the timestamp is included, I'll need to check all the content of the SBOM. I'll have to, again, I might be able to essentially remove there might be some mechanism for me to remove the timestamp and then, take the checksum and do it, but that's still more steps, right? Whereas like I like what sort of some folks have begun to do of like, no, I have like a timestamped envelope that includes stuff like the SBOM in it. So, you just as opposed to having it in the document itself. And I tend to just prefer timestamps to be included in envelopes outside of the document, because then it makes it easier to compare the data in them without necessarily needing to pull in temporal and other sorts of information of like, but I think given what we have, it's better than nothing, I guess. Like, because I do think timestamps are still important, because a lot of folks want to know, hey, when was the timestamp? When was this SBOM generated? Because we screwed up how we generated SBOMs last month or whatever it was. So that's still useful, but I do feel a little weird about including it in the document itself versus like an envelope that includes that.
So what you're almost saying is like a freshness guarantee on the SBOM document, right? It's like, here's the attestation that says that this SBOM is still the latest SBOM for this particular piece of software.
Yeah, because that might be different for like built software versus a SaaS versus a couple of other things versus, hey, did you know that we actually used a new SBOM tool that's much better? Right?
Okay.
And so last week we were using this bad SBOM tool. This week we used a new SBOM tool. So we actually are generating a better SBOM.
To me, the only problem with this external envelope is, where would that live, right? So if it's okay if the build tools are pushing SBOMs to GUAC or TPA, but if you're consuming somewhere something from from some bucket or other storage, we don't have that mechanism yet, right?
I feel like it is almost kind of like you have to go to a spot and then ask them like, what is the latest valid SBOM, right? And then it will tell you the answer.
Yeah, but even without asking, like if you are receiving SBOMs, right, and you get like the same one but with newer timestamp, you know that it should replace the previous one, right? By default, right? Unless you have extra conditions. So like that itself could mean like, yeah, you need to like reprocess the SBOM as and replace the previous one of the version of that, instead of just saying, oh, I already have it, we can ignore it. Like in case of Trustify, the whole file is hashed, right? So that's making that is irrelevant for Trustify right now, for example. But if you don't take calculate hashes of the content, then this field may be important for you to know, like, yes, I need to refresh whatever I already processed, right?
Would an alternative solution also be that SBOMs need to provide a hash of basically the content of the document without the timestamp? You know, like
Yeah, I think it can, right? Do the same thing. This just has extra value for humans or even tooling. I like to know when that was exactly, right? Like if you have 3 hashes, you cannot be sure of their order, right? But if you have 3 timestamps, you know which was first and which was last, right? Given they are in the same time zone and so on, so right, they are actually valid, right? Comparable.
So, Brendan, your main criticism is that this is the time step of the update, right? If we call it the time step of the SBOM generation, that would make sense, right? So this SBOM is created then and then. So every new SBOM is not updating the old one; it's creating a new one with the new timestamp and the new hash, right?
yeah. But I think that was my initial thinking. But then I feel like, you know, what Mike and Papa brought up is also valid, right? Is that even if we have the generated timestamp, if I want to know, one is like I want to know whether I'm using the correct SBOM, and then the second one is I want to know whether there was any changes, so I have to rescan it or something. Although I'm not sure whether that one is a. I wonder whether it is a optimization that we need, right? It's like maybe it's okay if we.
But if we have a generation timestamp, then it should be okay. So then you know that it's not the same SBOM, it's a new one. It's a new, yeah,
But
new
so
for the same for the same software, new one created with a new tool, right?
yeah,
On a different
Perfect.
date.
Yeah, I wanted to add that. Hey, you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to add that I think it should be very strict. The fact that you are uploading an SBOM to something that is already there. So if your SBOM is pointing to a specific artifact with a specific commit or shell, so you point to the specific piece of software that was built from that the SBOM was built from. I think regardless of the timestamp when it was generated, I think it should be very strict that you cannot just replace it by the fact that it's newer. I think it has to be some controls that you have to delete it or force the replacement of this SBOM. It's kind of when you create a tag or a new release. So when you package an artifact, you put your binaries or your artifact, you put the SHA, and why not you can put the SBOM altogether. But if you are using a different place to publish the SBOMs, then it should kind of follow the same constraints and be very strict. That's my opinion.
So it does sound like it is a. Sounds like it is a partially a distribution problem, right? Is that like we want to make sure that, I guess for software, if a new version gets launched, we want to use a new version. The same way, like if a new SBOM gets the new version of the SBOM gets certified, then we want to use that new SBOM as well.
Yeah, and this can like like already with like IDs of the document or the generation tool changing its version in its corresponding field, right? In case of you receive the SBOMs in like async way, or you have them stored somewhere, right? As you receive them, but you cannot be sure how what order you receive them, right? Then this gives you still the information how you should sort them and reprocess them, for example, right? Which otherwise you cannot deduce without this field.
Well, but I think we can use this timestamp, like a generation timestamp as a poor man's version, right? So do not complicate things. Like you get a you get a different SBOM with a newer timestamp or existing where you have existing one, and then that's the latest one. So you use that as a newest version of the SBOM, right?
Assuming you have like proper authentication of the SBOM.
No, just thinking, you have a SBOM for a product, right? With a timestamp, and then you receive or find somewhere a new SBOM for that same product with a newer timestamp. That's the new version, basically, yeah. So you use the latest one, based on this timestamp.
So it sounds like we're kind of talking about the two problems, right? One of them is how do I figure out when I need to get a new SBOM, and then we can say like, okay, timestamp, that's a good way for that. And then the other one that Mike mentioned was around, we want to figure out when we actually have to like rescan the SBOMs. I think that's kind of thinking about it in terms of there is a potentially a performance or computation issue, where are we expecting people to regenerate and create new SBOMs every day or every hour or something? I'm not sure whether that's something we, because I don't know how often people would regenerate their SBOM. So I kind of am also wondering whether that is something that we need to consider, or is it okay for us to just keep doing this for every new SBOM that we see?
Yeah, I think that goes down a deep rabbit hole of like the question of should you be rebuilding software regularly, even if there's no changes. Like I've definitely worked in organizations that said, nope, if we built it, then let's not touch it. And I've also worked at organizations that have said, no, we need to make sure that if anything were to ever happen, we could always rebuild it from scratch. Or not scratch, but like, rebuild it with our existing tools and without any major changes, that if like we were, because one of the things that has happened at previous orgs is, hey, we changed a couple of things around, we changed our build process, we weren't rebuilding stuff, and then like, oh, this thing broke, we now need to fix it, but we now have no idea on how to rebuild it, which again is out of the scope of what we just talked about. But I just think that like, I tend to lean on, if you are building the software, given that building, especially if you're building the software, you should be generating an SBOM if you can, right? Because generating an SBOM as part of the build process is almost always more accurate than any of the other ones.
I think in that regard, then I think what you're saying is the likelihood that we get a new SBOM will be probably at most the same cadence as we get people that building new artifacts every day, like kind of the cloud native way, right?
Yeah, yes, I think so. And I think I would also separate it from downstream SBOMs that go because you released a thing versus SBOMs that are still worthwhile to use internally. Like one of the big use cases that folks use for right, our stuff, Kusari stuff, is like, hey, I want to know like if I have a release SBOM called V1, and I have a bunch of build SBOMs of like whatever it is, like, you know, V1, you know, or sorry, like, you know, V2 alpha 1, V2 alpha 3, whatever. If I have a bunch of SBOMs between V1 and V2, right, I distribute V1, I distribute V2 to my downstream consumers, but I'm not actually releasing all the stuff that's in between. But the stuff that's in between is still valuable for me to understand what dependencies changed, when did they change, and you can like link them back to the code changes, right? Like you get all of that great stuff there, which again, to me is like way beyond the minimum piece of a minimum element of like, hey, most folks are not really considering it that way. But I do like that idea of just, yeah, you should be, if you build a thing, you should probably be generating an SBOM, even if the build is never going to be released. It's a candidate or whatever. It's a dev build or what have you. That can still be used and diffed against your other SBOMs to understand stuff like, oh, we said we updated the SBOM. We said we updated this requirement or this dependency, but it doesn't appear to have actually updated in our build. What went wrong? Like you can start to figure out those sorts of problems when you are actually generating SBOMs on a regular basis. You can also detect like, hey, we fixed 2 vulnerabilities in this, you know, after these changes, 2 more after these changes. 2 weeks went by and these new ones came in. Like just these new ones were discovered, and then we fixed these 2 others, and then we fixed these 2 others, and then we had 0, and then we released it. Like you can begin to track that.
So that's like a SBOM for every release artifact along the lineage of piece of software. That's not okay. Okay, yeah. And then assuming that if it's reproducible and it produces the same thing, then you get weird SBOM and software version mismatches. Pavel.
Yeah, so I think this may be like exactly like practical use case for this, but also this is not aimed at the software version, software like component build time version link info, like the, you know, like alpha 1 to whatever, right? This is more focused on the generation of SBOM itself or the update specifically, right? Because like so I would assume this is meant for when you do change the tooling, right, or the procedure for the generation of SBOMs, and you want to generate stuff, right? Because it's the main purpose seems to be aimed at when the existing SBOM with the same, otherwise like IDs got updated, right? So like the document itself, you know, is the same. Some dependencies may change inside or something, obviously. So something was updated, but this is like to denote that there was an update actually, like that happened. Like I mean, when thinking about the most extreme, like imagining like someone writes the SBOM by hand, right, and then they realize next day they made typo, and they're like, oh wait, I will fix the typo, right, and then send you over email the SBOM again, right. And like and now from the extreme applied like automated build system, you find you had a bug in your, you know, dependency analyzing parts, you correct it, right, and you let all the SBOMs generate, right, for like last day or 2 or whatever necessary, right? And then you boom, you get bunch of same same software, same builds. Actually, you didn't even rebuild, right? But suddenly you got bunch of updated SBOMs, right?
Yeah.
So like I think that's more for like this use case.
So it sounds like I mean, based on what I'm hearing, it sounds like we are okay with saying that if you generate a new SBOM, you put it there, that becomes like, you know, if you call the API or you go to the location on which the artifact is published and you see a SBOM, that's going to be the latest like that's going to be the SBOM that you're authorizing as like the SBOM to be used, right? And then if they generate a new SBOM, they're going to override it we are not saying that they need to kind of keep a history of that. But if we observe a SBOM previously in our state of the supply chain graph, then we're gonna keep the history so that we know that this was dependency information we knew yesterday. Today we got new information. But at least like if an audit comes and says like, "Oh, do you respond to this vulnerability?" we can say that we didn't because the SBOM didn't actually include it. So in terms of distribution system, it sounds that we are saying it's okay if we get the latest SBOM as long as the SBOM is so-called authorized by whoever's publishing the artifact. And then on the consumption side, there is a concern that we may be getting a lot of SBOMs and then we have to reprocess all of them. But I think based on the discussion, it seems like the cadence of getting a new SBOM will be at most the cadence of getting a new artifact being built. And it sounds like that's not too bad computation-wise, so we don't need to be too concerned about rescanning an SBOM every time an update happens. And in conclusion, I think that seems like we're okay with the recommendation. Okay. I see we only have less than 5 minutes left. Based on this discussion, how do folks feel about creating a response with the RFC?
So do we have anything concrete that you put in the response?
We have a couple things. So based on the list, there's a couple things where we're like, great, this is good. We support this. We have, I think, in the point you brought up, Dan, on holding back information. Like, there's no way to encode this in standards today, so that has to be done before it becomes minimal elements.
Yeah.
We have a bit on being opinionated on hashing and
Yeah.
the depth of the major version. And a bit on being able to detect whenever there is a change in the SBOM. Yeah. It doesn't have to be a long response, right? It can just be like, here are a few things.
Yeah, sounds good, I think. We should.
I have a question. Have you discussed anything around what you just said, Brandon? Making sure that two SBOMs are equivalent? I don't know, canonicalizing.
Oh yeah, Santiago should be here. Santiago has been looking at this.
So regardless of the tool that you use to generate an SBOM,
yeah.
It can be that you end up with two equivalent SBOMs pointing to the same artifacts with the same hierarchy and same hashes. So that ideally, okay. So,
so
this is already discussed.
I would maybe you can ping Santiago Torres in the Slack channel, and then we can chat that. Maybe we should get him on this meeting and then talk about it. He was doing some work with his PhD students on this, so they're writing a tool to kind of like do kind of like the tree comparison of the dependencies and the identifier comparisons as well.
Okay, because I think this is an interesting topic.
It's a very interesting topic. Let me just. Are you on the Slack? Oh yeah, I see you on the Slack.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, I'll start yeah. This is. I'll send you his tag, and then maybe you can tag him and tag me, and then we can try and schedule him in to chat. Awesome. All right, we had time. It sounds like maybe next week we can talk about drafting the document and then sending it up. Cool. All right. Thanks everyone.